Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Naseem Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Robani. Hello, Moin. Good to see you again.
Always good to see you, Naseem.
So I want to begin this week with the Balfour Declaration. This show, actually, this weekly review, we've been running now. I think it's our 40th episode. And we've spoken so much about Gaza, and we will speak about Gaza as well, but we've never really spoken about the historical context. I want to begin this week by speaking about the historical context, and I thought there's no better time than in the month of the anniversary of the infamous Balfour Declaration. So we'll begin with that, and then we'll do our tour of the Middle East and Gaza in particular. And then we'll finish with a conversation regarding the US election and the possibility of an Iranian strike during the time of the election, what kind of impact that may have. But let's begin, as I said, with the Balfour Declaration.
Mhm.
You issued a tweet to mark the occasion yourself. I just want to get your thoughts first, and then I'll add my comments about it as well. But let's discuss the Balfour Declaration and why it's a significant moment for the Palestinians, and not just Palestinians, the region as a whole.
Yeah. Well, for Palestinians, November has always been a month of commemorations. You have the commemoration of the Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, the proclamation of Palestinian statehood on November 15th. That was in 1988. And then November 29th, you have the commemoration of the United Nations General Assembly's partition resolution, and which is now also the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. There may be one or two others I'm forgetting. But the Balfour Declaration, issued on the 2nd of November 1917, is a document of paramount importance because the case can arguably be made that without the British commitment to the implementation of the Zionist program that was proclaimed by the Balfour Declaration, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today because all the key developments that came during the rest of the 20th century and indeed during the 21st were essentially dependent on Great Britain seizing control of Palestine in the aftermath of the First World War and imposing the Zionist program on Palestine by force of arms. Uh, Left without imperial sponsorship, and sponsorship not only of an imperial power, but of what was then the most powerful state on earth, Zionism would have probably ended up in the dustbin of history as yet one more utopian nationalist project that came to nothing. The Zionism did not have the power, did not have the means to independently impose itself on Palestine and the Palestinian people. Therefore, from the very outset of the Zionist movement in the late 1890s, it put extraordinary effort into securing an imperial patron. That was finally achieved in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, which committed Great Britain to the establishment of what it called a Jewish national home in Palestine. That declaration, in turn, was incorporated into the 1922 League of Nations mandate awarded by the League of Nations to Britain. And without British control over Palestine, what the preeminent Palestinian historian Walid al-Khalidi has called the British Shield, Zionism could not have succeeded in establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, by which one should go with the Zionist definition of a Jewish state, a state in which the Jewish community achieves demographic, territorial, and political hegemony. In other words, the transformation of the Arab territory of Palestine into an exclusivist Jewish state.
Um,
Okay.
um, yes, I mean, I think the point you make is really important that without the Balfour Declaration, I don't think we would be discussing the ethnic cleansing and the genocide of Gaza. And I think on a wider point, something many people miss out when they discuss the Balfour Declaration is that in all likelihood, Middle East would have been a very different Middle East. Palestinian refugees would not have emerged as a political actor in the region. New Arab states would not have had to manage a humanitarian catastrophe that was Palestinian refugees in 1948, which was way beyond their capacity. So these new nations were burdened with problems which was way beyond the capacity. So that's another issue. And I also think we wouldn't be speaking about the West committing itself to this garrison state, the state of Israel, whose domination of the region that they were really committed to. So there's all these other implications of the Balfour Declaration which we don't really point out. And I don't think we would be seeing the US the Israeli lobby in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere, so committed to a project in the Middle East or trying to control and dominate the Middle East in the way they are without Israel being so central to their hegemony. So the Balfour Declaration, yes, for the Palestinians, but for the region, but also domestically in the US and in the UK as well, it's been such a catastrophe, which I think people fail to comprehend.
Yeah.
Moving on from that, let's turn, as we normally do. I mean, we speak a lot about Gaza, and we've spoken about,
As we should.
as we should, because there is a ongoing genocide, and if we don't speak about the ongoing genocide, then who would? And it's, new details are emerging that Israel, there is a blueprint for an ethnic cleansing of Gaza, northern Gaza, and there's a constellation of actors from generals to settlers to various organizations who are actually implementing that plan. And that plan was highlighted by Plus 972 magazine, who has been doing amazing work over the past year, exposing many of the genocidal practices of the Israeli state. And last week also, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, he also came out and warned of ethnic cleansing in northern Gaza, as have many others. So what's the state of play at the moment in northern Gaza? We know there is, as I said, many have spoken about the ethnic cleansing that's taking place, and details of that is emerging more and more as we, go through this genocide.
Well, it's hard to overstate the catastrophe that is being inflicted upon the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. As you mentioned, Plus 972, the Israeli electronic magazine, did an outstanding report on Israel's plan, and I think it's titled Exterminate, Expel, and something else. Antonio Guterres, unfortunately very much a latecomer to the party, is now also raising the alarm. And recently, a number of UN agencies pointed out that every single individual in the northern Gaza Strip is at risk of dying. I mean, Israel is bombing the entrances to clinics, which, with its approval, have been identified as locations where children can receive urgently needed polio vaccines. It is bombing children and others who are in the process of collecting water because it has cut off all food, water, medical, electricity, and food, fuel supplies to the northern Gaza Strip. It has bombed every one of the hospitals in that territory, including most recently a maternity ward and a children's ward within Gamal Adwan Hospital were directly targeted. But this has become so normalized and such a accepted pattern of Israeli conduct that it barely rated a mention in the mainstream media. And the bombing is said to be constant and incessant. And every day we're hearing about a new massacre. The intensity of casualties in the northern Gaza Strip since this offensive began in I believe it was in early October, is virtually unprecedented, even by the scale of what Israel has been doing throughout the Gaza Strip during the past year. It has essentially sealed off the northern Gaza Strip from the central and southern parts of the territory, the so-called Netzarim corridor. And it has now also bisected the northern Gaza Strip so that you have Jabalia refugee camp, Jabalia town, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun, which are the most northern parts of the Gaza Strip, isolated from Gaza City to its south. And it's engaging in a campaign of what can only be described systematic killing, systematic destruction, systematic siege, and systematic deprivation of the very basic essentials of life. And its purpose, I think, is not only to try to defeat Hamas. One would think a relatively simple task for an army as powerful as Israel, but one which in which it is encountering growing challenges and a growing body count for its soldiers, but to entirely empty the northern Gaza Strip of any Palestinian life, razing it to the ground, expelling or killing all those who were there, conducting these mass arrests and placing numbers on drawing numbers on the foreheads of detainees and something. This really is very reminiscent of the Warsaw Ghetto during the Second World War. There's really no need to mince words about this. What is happening in the northern Gaza Strip, something we know about thanks to the extraordinary courage and heroism and dedication and commitment of the few Palestinians who are still operating in that territory and who are also being targeted and killed, by the way. Is really beyond words. And as with the rest of this genocide, Israel's chief allies and sponsors have decided to treat it with either active support by making repeated statements that they support Israel's right of self-defense, in other words, redefining genocide as a legitimate act of self-defense, or otherwise passively acquiescing in what Israel is doing by not only not imposing any consequences on Israel for its conduct, as is the case, for example, with the European Union, but ensuring that there will be no consequences by anyone else for Israel for this genocidal rampage.
Israel, of course, is also carrying out systematic starvation. That's one of the other crimes it's committing in northern Gaza. And not only is it stopping aid from going in, it's also bombing food depots, bombing storage places where
Food
flour is
depots,
kept.
pharmaceutical
Everything.
stock, everything.
Yeah,
Everything.
and the Plus 972 magazine, it went on to say that what's happening is worse than the general's plan. We've spoken about the general's plan,
Yes.
and it's more sinister, more brutal, more bloody. And I would recommend everyone to go and read that article just to understand the sheer devastation. And while Israel carries out its genocide in Gaza, one of the things it's been doing over the last year is questioning the casualty figures and trying to present the number of deaths in Gaza as though this is the average across all major conflicts in an urban area. And it's rolled out a number of so-called experts from the US and elsewhere to provide some kind of legitimacy to Israel's genocidal campaign, saying, no, Israel's not killing as many people as you say. The proportion is more or less the same. And now it turns out there's a new report. Of course, we've always known this, but there's a new report that's just come out to say that, no, the killing in Gaza, the destruction in Gaza, as a ratio is way more than anything we've seen in any other conflict. So while Israel presents the death toll as 50-50, 50% Hamas fighters, 50% civilians, now it turns out, according to a report by Action on Armed Violence, that 74% of people killed are civilians. So I mean, just want to get your thoughts on this new report and how that kind of debunks. I mean, every single Israeli argument has been debunked, but how this also now debunks the Israeli narrative.
Well, it's a very important report produced by Matthew Cockerill for, as you mentioned, Action on Armed Violence, AOAV. available on their website, written in plain English. I would encourage everyone to read it and judge for themselves. And what he's basically done is, first of all, determined the credibility of the casualty figures that are provided by the Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip, and demonstrates how they have repeatedly proven to be credible and accepted as credible by any external party that's relevant, including, the Americans and the Israelis and others. Then he's broken them down by age and sex, and on that basis has assumed that all infants, children under, I can't remember which age, women, and senior citizens can all, by definition, be considered civilian non-combatants. And then there are two age groups of men that contain both combatants and non-combatants. And by looking at the proportion in past conflicts or past Israeli assaults on the Gaza Strip, and extrapolating from that, he has arrived at a conservative figure, as he puts it, of 74% civilian casualties. This, of course, directly contradicts what we've been hearing from Israeli apologists and hacks like John Spencer and Andrew Fox, who have spent the past year telling us, that never in human history has an army gone out of its way to prevent civilian casualties and care for civilians, and provide them with caviar and filet mignon and all the rest of it, as has Israel in the Gaza Strip. And they have come up with this absurd figure they've concocted out of thin air, that the proportion of combatant to non-combatant casualties is 1-to-1. In other words, that 50% of casualties are combatants. And what's the other part that's interesting about the study, it has also been endorsed by Professor Paul Spagat, someone who has in the past been skeptical of these figures, but has looked at Cockerill's study and endorsed it. And he's one of the leading global experts on the issue of calculating civilian casualties. And he's also previously, in fact, taken issue with what these apologists like Spencer and Fox have been writing about Israeli conduct in the Gaza Strip. I mean, the long and short of it is, you can't be engaged in a genocidal campaign and at the same time not only claim to be the most moral army in the world, but also claim that what is happening is unprecedented in terms of constraints the army is placing on itself to avoid civilian casualties. I think Fox, I believe it was, recently got a guided tour of the genocide in the northern Gaza Strip by the Israeli military, and put out this sob story about how these Israeli soldiers feel this is a job that must be done. They're full of empathy and sympathy for those who they are slaughtering en masse, and so on. Of course, directly contradicted by what these soldiers and officers and politicians are themselves posting on social media. But it just shows how morally bankrupt, how scholarly bankrupt, how the extraordinary level of cowardice and apologia that these people in their ilk are engaged in. So I think, what Cockerill has done is very important, because once again, this is someone who has looked at the data, studied it, knows his stuff, has provided a very detailed analysis to substantiate his conclusions, and even more importantly, has provided it in plain English so that people who are not specialists in this field, like you or I, can go and read it, look at the evidence, and make up our minds whether this is or is not a credible rendition of the facts.
And one of the I would say aspects of the blueprint Israel is implementing for the genocide in Gaza is the attack on UNRWA. Last week, Israel, of course, banned UNRWA. And this week, they issued a letter to the UN saying that they would stop all their cooperation with UNRWA. But there's been a backlash from that. Some of it, I would say, quite disingenuous because they're saying, oh, if you close down UNRWA, then it'll be catastrophic, for the Palestinians, as though there isn't a
You don't
catastrophe
say.
already, as though there isn't a plan already to manufacture, create, or as though this isn't by design, somehow. But in any case, what's been the response? I mean, I know Norway, for example, is seeking to add Israel's attack on UNRWA as part of the ICJ case on genocide. So speak to us a bit about that as well.
Well, my understanding is that Norway is engaging in a separate initiative, which is to seek a further advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. The idea would be that the General Assembly would request a binding advisory opinion from the court on the legality of Israel's measures against UNRWA. I think there's two comments that need to be made here. The first is that Israel's campaign against UNRWA needs to be understood in its broader context. This is a campaign, along with Israel's acolytes, for example, in the US Congress and on the European far right, that have consistently targeted UNRWA for everything under the sun. But their target is not necessarily UNRWA itself, by which I mean that for them, UNRWA is the most visible surrogate of the Palestinian refugee question as a whole. And they believe that if they can somehow get rid of UNRWA, they can get rid of Palestinian refugees. They can get rid of the Palestinian refugee question. So they come up with all these hoaxes, such as, Palestinian refugees alone are the descendants of Palestinian refugees are unique in that they and they alone are defined as refugees, as if Somalis and Afghans and others in similar situations aren't also so defined. The whole campaign against supposed inefficiency and corruption by UNRWA, and most recently, these allegations that UNRWA is actually a subsidiary of Hamas and so on. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, as so often, Israel doesn't just barge in and take extreme measures. It has a consistent practice of starting with a trial balloon. So what it has done here is it has announced that it has informed UNRWA that I believe after 90 days, all relations between the Israeli government and UNRWA will be severed, that it will revoke and renounce its 1967 agreement, pursuant to which UNRWA could continue operating in the occupied territories. And it's now waiting to see what happens in the next 90 days. Will the U.S. trot out John Kirby and Matthew Miller to emphasize Israel's right to defend itself? Will the European Union suffice with expressions of grave concern and look the other way as Israel has its way with UNRWA? Or will the Norwegian initiative in the General Assembly succeed and not only produce a binding advisory opinion pursuant to which Israel must allow UNRWA to continue operating, but will it also be a binding advisory opinion that UN member states will actually take measures to enforce? And based on that, Israel will move either forward or backwards. And as we discussed last week also, I think, the scale of the UN, of the Israeli campaign against the United Nations, whether it's a Secretary General, UNRWA, other UN women and other bodies is really without precedent since the world body was established in 1945. Yes, many states have taken measures against the UN or one of its agencies here or there, but the idea that a national parliament adopts a resolution defining a UN agency as a terrorist organization and then adopts a further parliamentary resolution effectively outlawing that agency is, to the best of my understanding, without precedent. And again, this has happened not only because Israel's Western sponsors and allies have decided to suffice with at most verbal expressions of concern, knowing full well that Israel understands that verbal protests means no protest and that it can continue. But even the UN itself, I mean, in the person of its Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, has been walking on eggshells for months, lamenting the deaths, the unprecedented deaths, as he would put it, of UN staff without even identifying who was killing them. Um, uh, Constantly seeking to appease Israel, and only recently beginning to grow a spine and call out Israel for its conduct. Well, unfortunately for him, it's proven too little, too late.
I guess what happens when you're drunk on impunity, drunk on power.
Yep,
You can
exactly.
you can attack the UN and all its bodies, and make all kinds of justifications. But you can also, I guess, carry out psyops against your so-called allies in the West, and that's exactly what I think has been happening with our next story, which is to do with Israel releasing information to torpedo the any kind of negotiation to release the hostages and peace deal. That's a scandal that's been unfolding in Israel over the past week. We spoke about this, I think, 2 months ago, where the Jewish Chronicle in the UK and the German Bild published articles in favor of Benjamin Netanyahu's narrative that the hostages, well, Sinwar was thinking of planning to take the hostages out of Gaza into Iran, which gave Netanyahu a justification to keep control of the Philadelphia corridor and his position on the hostages. And now it turned out that that was all fake. One person has been arrested, as far as I can tell.
I believe it's 5 at this
Oh,
point.
so 5 people have been arrested. So this is a scandal that's unfolding, and you have to ask, the US has constantly had the position that it was Hamas that did not want a hostage deal, and Israel was completely for it. Now it turns out not only was Israel against any kind of hostage deal, they were creating narratives and stories, planting stories in the Western press to torpedo any kind of negotiation hostage deal.
Well, the background to this is that over the summer, negotiations over a resolution of let's call it the crisis in Gaza, for those who take these negotiations seriously, appeared to be stuck on a key issue, excuse me, namely whether or not, as part of any agreement, Israel would fully withdraw from the Gaza Strip, meaning it would withdraw not only from the Netzarim corridor, which we were discussing earlier, but also what Israel calls the Philadelphia corridor, the border zone between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. And secondly, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the main obstacle, if not the only obstacle, to reaching an agreement was Israel in the form of its prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who, as you may remember, kept adding new conditions and moving the goalposts and so on. And then all of a sudden, these articles began appearing in not only the Israeli press, but in two of the Israeli right's favored foreign outlets, the Jewish Chronicle in the UK and Bild in Germany, where you began to see these stories that Israeli intelligence had discovered documents that Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader in the Gaza Strip, who has since been killed, was planning on escaping from the Gaza Strip along with the hostages, presumably boarding a commercial airliner in Cairo airport and flying with these hostages, across Sinai, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia towards Iran, where he was going to keep these hostages. And then other stories began appearing that, in fact, these negotiations were proving fruitless because Yahya Sinwar, as a matter of principle, was not going to sign any deal because he was convinced that the longer the Palestinians held on, the greater the likelihood that a regional conflict would erupt that would increase his leverage in any future negotiations with Israel. And the important thing about these stories is that they were based on supposedly documents that had been produced by Hamas or by Sinwar personally that Israeli intelligence had managed to capture in the Gaza Strip and that were now being leaked to these two favorite publications of the Israeli right in Europe. We've since then had the scandal with the Jewish Chronicle, in which the journalist who published these stories turned out to be not a journalist at all. But more recently, it has emerged that in fact these documents were deliberately being leaked by very close associates of the Israeli Prime Minister himself. And there have now been four arrests. And the somewhat comical aspect of this is that several of the people arrested who were accused of leaking these documents in fact, work for that unit of Israeli intelligence, which is responsible for preventing leaks. And it turns out that they're the ones who have been leaking this. So the long and short of the broader context here, of course, is Netanyahu attempting to frame the narrative so that he can kind of escape responsibility for being the one sabotaging and preventing an agreement that would end the war in the Gaza Strip and see the release of Israel's captives being held there. And there's also apparently an intelligence aspect to this, which is that those investigating these leaks are saying that although some of these documents were doctored, they do have the potential to expose Israeli intelligence sources and methods, or something to that effect. And the final point I would make is that the International Crisis Group analyst Meirav Zonshine has pointed out that there's really nothing new here, that Netanyahu does this all the time within Israel and is in fact on trial in Israel for exactly these kinds of dirty tricks. But that what is different here, what is new here, is that such information is now being leaked to foreign media outlets, and of course, a magazine like Bild, which is essentially a stenographer for the Israeli government, or the Jewish Chronicle, were very willing victims in this case, and it's I think quite likely they knew exactly what they were doing. The final broader point here is there have been so many stories over the past year in the Western mainstream media, whether you're talking about the Hamas Pentagon under Al Shifa Hospital, or Yahya Sinwar being surrounded by hostages, as using them as human shields and all the rest of it. So many of these stories that claim to be based on Hamas documents captured by the Israelis and being made available to star correspondents of some of the leading Western media. Will these now be revisited now that we know exactly what has been going on I don't think they will, unfortunately. I think these media will simply stand by their stories, tout their own professionalism, and move on to the next story based on leaked and fraudulent material provided by the Israeli intelligence services or the Israeli Prime Minister's office to them.
Mm. We spoke in the case of Gaza, we spoke about systematic destruction, systematic starvation, systematic killing. And I think we need to add to that systematic journalistic malpractice
Oh, yes.
across the West. That's another thing, one we should add to this story. And that takes us neatly into my penultimate story, which is 100 journalists in the BBC writing and complaining, protesting to the BBC's coverage, and that is connected to the Jewish Chronicle. I mean, one of the owners of the Jewish Chronicle, he actually sits on some kind of oversight committee within the BBC.
Robbie Gibb.
It was
Mm.
to monitor, impartiality. I mean, and this is a guy who's also the owner of the Jewish Chronicle. So shows how deep this goes, the malpractice goes. That is. So
I
just gone. Sorry.
no, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to speak to that, and also comments by British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, because I want to skip through this quite quickly while I get to the US
Yes.
elections. David Lammy, we should mention this because last week he said in Parliament in response to a question that no, we should not describe what's happening in Gaza as genocide. It undermines, demeans the use of the word genocide, because when we think of genocide, according to Lamy, it means, we apply this term to people, 1 million people are killed.
Yeah.
And
Yes. I
he's
mean,
been,
if unless there are 6 million victims, unless the victims are Jewish, and unless the perpetrator is Germany, it doesn't qualify as genocide.
yeah. It's completely wrong, of course. I mean, I actually wrote a piece, but so many other people have condemned him. I think people within his own party kind of thought, how can you make that comment for someone who is the foreign secretary to make such a blunder? It's quite outrageous.
Well,
Genocide
let's
is,
be clear what Lamy is doing. He's basically engaging in genocide denial. He's, according to his criteria, Rwanda, where I believe something on the order of 800,000 people were
sorry.
slaughtered, is no longer a genocide. Srebrenica in Bosnia, where 8,000 people were killed, and which was really the only incident in the Yugoslav wars that was explicitly identified as genocide by the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and by the International Court of Justice. That is no longer a genocide. And the reason that Lamy is engaging in genocide denial of things that every 3-year-old understands to be a genocide. The reason Lamy is engaging in this really, let's call it disgusting genocide denial. The reason he's doing that is so that he can defend Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip. In other words, once again, historical truth, the sanctity of the memory of the victims of Rwanda and Srebrenica and elsewhere is being sacrificed on the altar of Israeli impunity. Turning just briefly to the BBC, my understanding is that Robbie Gibb is not actually the owner of the Jewish Chronicle. Rather, he's the front man who refuses to reveal who the actual owners of the Jewish Chronicle are because it was
You're right, but the
told
reason
by
there's so much confusion around this, and I think this intentionally manufactured confusion to pin down exactly what his role is.
Yes,
But
and
yeah,
he's refusing to come clean. I mean, the
yeah.
guy is a study in obfuscation. Nevertheless, he's also emerged as a BBC's chief commissar when it comes to reporting on the Middle East. Of course, very ably assisted by Tim Davie and various others in the corporation. And for all the criticism of the BBC, let's not forget it's an organization that has many highly professional and dedicated and committed journalists, which has a storied history. And I think these people don't like the way that their organization, to which they've dedicated so much of their professional careers, has become somewhat of a laughing stock during the past year because of the way that it's dealing with genocide in Gaza. I mean, we've all seen these bizarre interviews, where every time a guest mentions genocide, he or she is berated by the BBC presenter who rattles off a whole list of Israeli talking points. I mean, it's almost, being interviewed by the BBC has become somewhat akin to an interrogation by the Shin Bet. And so these 100 journalists, joined by others, have written a letter of protest to management, saying that things have to change. That it needs to be, for example, that listeners and viewers need to be regularly informed that the BBC, and for that matter, all other international media, is being systematically prohibited from entering the Gaza Strip and reporting the story from the site. That when Israeli hacks and apologists make claims live on air without any evidence, they should be challenged to provide evidence, or it should be noted that they haven't produced any. But of course, today, the BBC, we were talking earlier about casualty figures and the credibility of the Hamas, of the Gaza Ministry of Health, which of course operated for almost 2 decades under the Hamas government. In BBC speak, thanks to Commissar Robbie Gibb, you're no longer allowed to say Gaza Ministry of Health. It now has to be Hamas-run Ministry of Health to kind of undermine its credibility before even providing any of its figures. We also see systematically, BBC, Palestinians aren't killed, they die. The identity of their murderers is simply never, very rarely, explicitly identified. The passive voice has become dominant on the BBC when it comes to Palestinian casualties, whereas emotional tones and so on are dominant when it comes to Israeli casualties. And it's these kinds of things that these journalists are protesting against because, their own professional reputation is at stake.
Hmm. I mean, you can imagine 100 staffers watching what they've been seeing for the past year, systematic genocide. And then you have the BBC motto of impartiality, neutrality, being fair and balanced. Where does that lie when you have on the one side genocidal rhetoric, execution of genocide, on the other side people who are just saying international law, we want basic human rights? Where does neutrality lie in that situation?
Well, I would just say things at the BBC have gotten so horrifically bad that if they were to treat the party committing genocide and the victims of genocide equally, if that's their definition of impartiality, to treat them as equally valid, even that would be a huge step in the right direction for Robbie Gibb's BBC.
Let's end with a discussion about the US election. US voters will be voting tomorrow. Whether it's Trump or Harris, we'll know hopefully by Wednesday if there isn't any challenge. First, let's start. What's your thoughts on that in terms of how it may impact on the Palestinian issue? I suspect it won't have much of an impact, but you issued a long tweet following I think, a discussion or an event you were part of. When I look at the US elect, people have described this as being a high stakes election. And when I see someone like Elon Musk, who has spent the past 6 months making the case that this is the election which is where US democracy is on the line. If the Democrats win, then this is the end of the US. This is the end of the US Constitution. When you say stuff like that, then you're almost calling for violence. That's what it sounds like to me. If the results don't go your way, then you are almost saying, look, the result is rigged somehow.
Yeah, just like in the good old days of white minority rule in South Africa, where Musk grew up.
Yeah. So I mean, do you think? I mean, there's any difference between Harris and Trump? I mean, Trump did say reportedly that he told Netanyahu that he wants the genocide of the war in Gaza, in his word, to be finished before he comes into office. So which suggests that, he wants to take a different course.
Well, there's several issues here. First of all, I don't want to get into the domestic consequences of this election. That's something that will affect, I think, mainly Americans. And if the best they can come up with is either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, all power to them. I would just note that in the United States, you don't have to win a majority of the votes to win the election. And in fact, there have been multiple elections, presidential elections, in the past 2 decades, where the successful candidate has lost the popular vote but ends up in the White House. That's, the democracy that they're trying to teach the rest of us. Regarding Palestine and the region, I think there are two separate issues. The first is the end of the Biden administration, and the second is any distinctions between Harris or Trump. So I think the election is significant in that it signals the end of the Biden administration. And I think it's fair to say that the level of fanatic devotion, and I use that term advisedly, that Biden has shown towards Israel is unlikely to be equaled by either Harris or Trump. And what that means is, and I think this is also how Israel sees it, and that from Israel's perspective, it has had unique opportunities during the Biden administration, and the clock will run down on January 25th, 2025, when Biden is wheeled out of the White House and his successor replaces him. I mean, I've seen Israeli press reports that even Israeli leaders have been taken aback at how far they have been able to go for how long without the United States, as it tends to do in such situations, eventually interfering and saying game's up. There's been none of that here, whether in terms of the genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip or the regional escalations that have now brought us to the brink of an Iranian-American direct military confrontation. So the fact that Israel sees Biden's departure as a significant political moment means that the period between today and January, irrespective of the election's result, is, in my view, a period of maximum danger. The other part of it concerns distinctions between Trump and Harris. And here I think it's a more difficult question to answer. I think it's probably fair to say that Harris, should she come to occupy the White House, will revert to the traditional American position of unconditional support for Israel, but with certain limits placed where Israel's conduct is seen by Washington's elite as contradicting or undermining core U.S. national security interests. With Trump, it could go either way. You mentioned that this phone call where he is supposed to have told Benjamin Netanyahu that I want this file closed by the time I enter the White House if I win. That strikes me as entirely plausible, given that Trump, an important part of his base, consists of isolationists, given that he has denounced both his Republican and Democratic predecessors of launching forever wars in the Middle East, and Trump is probably not someone who wants to start his term by getting engaged in a land war in the Middle East, in Iran, or anywhere else. So the idea that he has sent a clear message to Netanyahu to wrap this up before January is entirely plausible. But it's equally plausible that Trump will take U.S. intervention in the region to entirely new heights. And so here's Israel's problem. Um, while Trump, while Israel perhaps alone in the world in terms of the available public opinion polling, has an overwhelmingly expressed preference for Trump over Harris. And while Trump, at the rhetorical level, has aligned himself much more closely with Israel, he's also seen quite rightly as erratic and unpredictable and unreliable. And therefore, Israel is not going to wait until January to do its worst. It's going to do that before January because of Trump's unreliability. Harris is practically seen as an enemy by Israel. I mean, that's how far off the reservation Israeli elites and public opinion have gone. You know, the kind of traditional unconditional support of Israel with certain limits is viewed as hostility, is viewed as seeking to end Israel's viability as a state. The only other comment I would make is that it's very unlikely that the next U.S. president, whether Trump or Harris, will prove to be even more pro-Israeli than Biden has been.
I don't think that's even possible. The other thing with regards to the US elections is there is, of course, the looming threat by Iran saying that they will retaliate um, in following Israel's attack just I think 2 weeks ago now. Um, does it matter who wins in the US, whether Iran retaliates or not? I mean, Trump is seen as someone who would take more of a hawkish line on Iran, given that he pulled out of the nuclear deal, which that was struck by President Obama. So maybe the Iranians will look at this and think, okay, if Trump wins, we should really be careful how we respond to the Israeli strike. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, it's said that the Iranians have made a decision to retaliate against Israel's recent air attacks on Iran, and that the reason for their delay in retaliating is that they did not want to do anything in the run-up to the election that could be seen as bolstering Trump's re-election chances. And many people have now for at least several days been saying that an Iranian response to Israel's recent attacks appears increasingly likely and increasingly imminent. And the fact that it hasn't yet come, in my view, suggests that the Iranians, while not necessarily expressing any preference for Harris, did not want to engage in any action that could be seen as potentially bolstering Trump's election chances. In my view, the most likely date for such an attack, and here again, I'm only speculating, is the day after the election. First of all, because it comes after the election, and then the Iranians can't be accused of having done anything to influence the ballot, but also because November 6th is the 40th day after the Israeli assassination of Hezbollah's General Secretary, Hassan Nasrallah. And of course, the 40th day is an important commemoration. And that's a day on which we may well see some kind of combined attack, combined initiative by Iran, Hezbollah, and potentially others. But just to get back again very briefly to your question, I think the key issue with Iran is not the different approaches Trump or Harris would take. I'm sure there will be differences here and there, but the transition from the current administration, that of unconditional indulgence of Israel, and in effect allowing Israel to take the lead in setting U.S. Middle East policy, and a next administration where whether Trump or Harris is probably going to be more assertive about the U.S. Setting terms.
Thank you, Maureen. As ever, it's a pleasure speaking to you. And Hope to see you
Likewise.
again next week. And thank you all for tuning in and listening to our weekly review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and Moin Rabbani. Bye-bye.